Welcome to TheKillFile, your favorite true crime podcast. I'm your host, Brittany Spears. Each week, we will explore the dark corners of true crime, unsolved mysteries, and murder. Join me as we uncover secrets, investigate evidence, and dive into the chilling details of some of the most fascinating cases. Get ready for a journey into the dark unknown because, in TheKillFile, nothing stays buried forever. Hello there, and welcome to episode 73 of TheKillFile. I am so glad that you guys are back for another story. Before we jump into today's case, a few quick reminders. First off, please take a second to rate, review, subscribe, or follow wherever you listen for the newest episodes every Monday. Also, find us on our social media platforms. We are on Blue Sky, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and of course, YouTube. Next, check out the website at thekillfile.com where you can find the merch shop with newly added merch all the time. We have anything from cozy sweatshirts for the winter to fun true crime t-shirts. Treat yourself as the holiday season is about to begin. Also, if you enjoy The Kill File and you're wanting some bonus content, I would say sign up for the Hidden Files over on Patreon. You can find the link on our website, or you can go to patreon.com/thekillfile, where you can pay just $5 a month for 2 bonus episodes. And as the podcast grows, the perks will grow as well. These Hidden File episodes are going to be a little different than our regular Monday episodes. They will include things like assassinations, mobsters' lives, and even plane crashes. One category that I want to start will be called Listener Files, where you or someone you know can write in your own story having to do with true crime, for it to be possibly read on an episode with commentary from yours truly. These can be anything from a time that you saw a gas station being robbed to your neighbor being a victim of Ted Bundy. Light or dark, long or short, send those in to thekillfilepodcast@gmail.com or fill out the form on the website. Remember, you can stay anonymous and feel free to change the names so no one will know it's you. Just send those emails in. I really want to know what you guys have been through or seen and how it affected you. Okay, that's it for business. Let's talk about today's case. Today, we are going to talk about a serial killer named Robert Pickton. Trigger warnings for today are going to be rape, murder, dismemberment, and brutality. Here we go. Today's case is going to bring us all the way to Port Coquitlam, British Columbia in the years 1995 to 2001. For anyone who doesn't know, because I sure as shit did not, I've told you before and I will tell you again, I am a fucking moron when it comes to geography. Canada is split into 10 provinces and 3 territories. One of the provinces, which I guess are similar to like states in the US, is British Columbia. Port Coquitlam, from what I can see, is not very far from the Washington border. In fact, research says it's only 23 miles from something called the Peace Arch Border Crossing, which is considered to be in Washington state. Port Coquitlam, from the language of the First Nations people spoke in this specific area called Halhomalam, gives it the meaning small red salmon, which I guess is the fish that's abundant in Coquitlam's river. According to an AI overview of the area in the late 90s, Port Coquitlam was growing rapidly, with new immigrants flooding to the area, which then led to a building boom. Old areas were redeveloped and new buildings were put up, expanding the city's infrastructure. The city had a small town feel and was said to be family-friendly, which makes what we're about to talk about all the more shocking. Before we jump into the conversation about our serial killer today, we need to touch on a topic and learn about one more thing. Pigs. Yes, pigs. Most of us have probably heard by now that pigs and/or hogs will eat almost anything, including people. If you didn't know that, you are in for a real treat on this case. So, real quick, pigs or hogs will eat anything from meat, including people meat, or even other pigs. And they are also known to consume bones. Yep. So, if a pig, probably more like a hog or a boar, but I'm just going to say pig, comes across human remains or is even hungry enough, although rare, they could even attack a human as a food source. Most often, a pig is going to attack a human in either defense, protecting its young, or if it's being territorial. But what happens when a pig does come across a human in one way or another and then decides to consume it? The pig will eat the flesh like they would eat any other meat, and this goes for the organs and the bones as well. When a pig comes across a larger bone that it may have a harder time with, it can usually crush it down or break it apart for easier digestion. They will even eat teeth. Things that pigs may leave behind that they are uninterested in eating are usually things like hair or harder bones that they can't break up, or if it's just too big and it can't be broken down. This brings us to our serial killer today, a man named Robert William Pickton. William Pickton, back in 1905, would buy some land not far from what was said to be a psychiatric hospital, this being Robert Pickton's, or Willie Pickton's as he's known, his great-grandfather. William was said to have been in business of raising hogs on the land, something that would be passed down for generations of the Pickton's family. Unfortunately, in the 50s, the Picktons would be forced to sell the land due to a highway being put in. Leonard Pickton and his wife, Helen Louise, known as Louise, would buy 40 acres of land that was a swamp, really, in the year of 1963, paying $18,000 for it. In today's money, that would be a little more than $190,000 for the 40 acres, which I could be totally wrong, but that still seems like a steal, no? When they bought the land, the Picktons would bring along their farmhouse, having it towed to the land. Leonard and Louise would go on to have 2 sons that they would name Robert William Pickton, nicknamed Willie, born on October 24th in 1949, and David, born in 1950. They also had one daughter who they named Linda. Sources would say that Linda was not raised on the farm, but rather she was raised in the city and had attended a boarding school, and eventually would marry into some money, moving to Vancouver. Both David and Willie were raised on the farm primarily by their mother, who was said to be less than great with her skills as a caregiver. People who personally knew Louise had described her as peculiar and eccentric, as well as being tough on her boys when it came to work. She wanted to instill in her children the importance of hard work, but sources would say that she took it way too far. She was known to have forced the 2 boys to work long hours on the farm, where they had the responsibilities of taking care of animals, slopping pigs, and all of this was even on school days. An article in the Star about the Pickton case would say that people who knew him said that he had confessed that when he wanted to hide from somebody, he would crawl inside of a large hog carcass and hide. Some sources would say that even though this land was a pig farm, there weren't as many pigs on it as you might think. Other sources seem to disagree. One thing was known: there was a large boar on the land that apparently chased people and tried to bite them. One source said it was over 600 pounds. Another story that many people had seemed to really think affected Pickton was the fact that at some point his parents slaughtered a calf that was Pickton's pet. He had actually raised him himself since he was a little boy. This affected him for his entire life, and he would often tell the story to other people. Pickton would end up socially awkward, which would in turn lead him to being isolated, and of course this would lead him to becoming somewhat of a pariah in school. He ended up in some special education classes because he was said to be slower in school. He was said to never really date, and some thought that this could be because he didn't have very good hygiene. And I can imagine that that would do it. I can't imagine that a girl would really want a pig farmer boy who actually smelled like pigs. In many sources, it was said all throughout this story that there were pig carcasses rotting all over the property. Eventually, Pickton would quit school about halfway through high school. People that knew Pickton would say that even after high school, the man reeked. They said he smelled like dirt, dead animals, and manure. He was known to always be wearing dirty clothes as well. Pickton would tell a friend who would nag him about his need to take a shower that he was terrified of showering, claiming that his mother always made him take a bath. The friend would tell him that it was unbearable, so he would eventually listen to her and take a bath, never a shower. One source would say that Pickton ended up showing some sociopathic tendencies along with a desire to be dominant over other people. One story that was known to have happened that would affect Dave, Pickton's younger brother, and it can kind of show the character of Louise, their mother, as well. Apparently, when Dave was learning how to drive, he was 16 years old, and in October of 1967, a younger teen, a 14-year-old boy named Tim Barrett, was walking down the road, and as Dave approached him in the truck, somehow he smashed right into Tim. Dave saw that Tim was really injured and was said to be laying on the side of the road. Panicked, Dave went home and told his mom. Louise was said to have dropped everything and raced to where Tim was. When she approached the boy, she took a good look at him, and for whatever sinister reason, she would roll the heavily injured Tim off of the road and to the edge of what I guess was a swampy area that ran along the road. Louise then pushed Tim into the water, and then she left. Sources would say that obviously Dave didn't know what to do and he was afraid he was going to get in trouble, so he took the truck straight to the mechanic and asked him to pull the dent out of the front. Dave also had the turn signal replaced that was broken. Sadly, after Tim was initially missing, his family was terrified. His parents, Philip and Lois, were looking for their son all over until 1 a.m. when they would head to the local police station to make a report that their son had vanished. The very next day, in the morning, one of Barrett's neighbors was out searching for Tim with his parents, as her own son was said to have seen Tim the day before. While searching the road where he had been seen, the neighbor and Philip Barrett decided to go look in the swampy area that was only about 10 feet off of the road. This is when they would unfortunately see Tim's body. Tim's autopsy showed that drowning was his cause of death, which means the truck hitting him was not what killed him, even though he had unfortunately suffered a fractured, dislocated pelvis, a fractured skull, and subcranial hemorrhaging. As a result of all the compounding evidence, Dave was sent to juvenile court, but we don't know what he got for what happened because at the time Dave was a minor and his record was then sealed afterwards, but sources would say that he did get into some kind of trouble even though the death was ruled accidental. This just goes to show you the type of woman who raised these boys. Someone who obviously cared less about a child's life than about her own son getting into a little trouble. I couldn't help but wonder what else she had taught them. Leonard, Pickton's father, would die in 1978 and his mother Louise following not long after in 1979. After his parents passed away is around the time that Pickton decided to try and change himself a little in hopes of finding someone. In the year 1994, suddenly the Picktons would find themselves filthy rich. Their parents had bought the farmland that they had lived on, remember, for $18,000 in 1963. And by 1994, the value of the land skyrocketed to $7.2 million. By that fall, the Picktons decided to sell parts of their land, benefiting to the tune of $1.7 million, where the company that bought it was going to develop the land and eventually put up some townhomes. Also, in 94, the city itself, Port Coquitlam, bought some of the land for another $1.2 million, wanting to turn their chunk of the land into a park. The very next year, so 1995, the city's school district would buy another chunk of the farm for $2.3 million, and here is where they would build a school called Blakeburn Elementary. This would be around the time that women would start to vanish in the area. Of course, now millionaires, the Picktons, would stop really farming their land or doing anything that they should to keep it up. They still had some pigs, and they were still butchering and selling the meat, but what they really became interested in was the idea for a non-profit. In 1996, the brothers would start something that they would call Piggy's Palace Good Times Society. Yeah, this would be a quote-unquote charity that was registered federally and was allegedly going to raise funds for service organizations, and the money would be raised by hosting shows and dances and events at the palace. Let me be clear as to what kind of place this was. The Piggy Palace was essentially a slaughterhouse that had been converted into an event hall. Sources say that Picktons were still running a slaughterhouse and a butcher shop at the same time that this charity hall opened. People who would attend these so-called charity events recalled the scene being much different. Sources would say that in one night, as many as 1,700 guests would be on the farm, and the crowds were deemed less than desirable. One person who was privy to one of these events would tell a tale that showed the true colors of these so-called fundraising events. A man would say that he arrived to a Halloween party at the Piggy Palace, and when he arrived around 9 p.m., there was a pig roasting on a spit. It was wet, soggy, muddy, and it was still raining out. He remembered lots of old cars parked around and tons of motorcycles as well. He described kids playing outside in the dark, in their Halloween costumes, and everything was very dark around the palace. He would say that there were in attendance a ton of women who, to him, seemed like sex workers, and while the crowd was enormous, he found that inside of the house and inside of the trailer, all sorts of people were having sex. The thing that would scare him away, as if that crazy scene wasn't enough, was that as he was walking by what he said was a shack that only had a very dim light bulb that was hanging over the door. You can just picture how creepy that is. He said as he was walking by, he heard some type of machine whirring inside, and this made him stop dead in his tracks. He knew whatever was happening in that shack could not be good. Here, there is a party with a ton of people, but something sinister had to be happening in that shack this late at night. This was enough to make him turn and head straight home. He would later say he wanted no part of whatever was happening there. This would become a story that many people would tell, as it was known that events that took place at the Piggy Palace were indeed these types of sexually fueled parties, essentially that many times was filled to the brim with bikers and sex workers. The Big Book of Serial Killers, written by Jack Rosewood and co-authored Rebecca Lowe, would say that the Piggy Palace was a regular spot for the Hells Angels to hang out at. Neighbors had apparently constantly complained of the noise level, people's drunken shenanigans, drug abuse, and all-around annoyance of the constant ongoings at the palace. Now, in the area, it was known that the downtown East Side was a place that had higher rates of sex work, homelessness, poverty, and even according to the Canadian Encyclopedia, open drug use. It was also known, and it was a problem for this area, that starting back in 1978 with the disappearance of a sex worker named Lillian Jean O'Dare, that women of the trade were going missing and vanishing over the next 20 years. For whatever reason, the cases didn't really seem to lead anywhere, but my guess is that it's the same old song and dance that we've heard time and time again. Sex workers were, and still are, treated as less than. So let's talk a little bit about how Willie Pickton would find his victims and how he would eventually kill them. According to court documents in the case, it was alleged that Pickton would frequent the downtown East Side to find sex workers, where he would then lure the women away from where they would usually work and back to his farm. The farm was said to be about 18 miles away from the downtown area, and Pickton was usually offering the women either money or drugs, or the documents said sometimes even both. It was then alleged that Pickton's usual method of murder, and this came from his own mouth, was to bring the woman to the farm. He would engage in sexual activity with them, handcuff them, and then he would proceed to murder the women. It was known that Pickton would sometimes strangle the women with a piece of wire, and other times he would stab them to death or even bludgeon them. It would later be found out that after Pickton would murder a victim, he would essentially butcher the victim, and then, according to a witness, he was told by Pickton himself that he would allegedly run the victims' dead bodies through a wood chipper and then feed it to the pigs. He would take whatever the pigs or huge boar didn't eat to a rendering plant, where they would take leftover parts from what they assumed were from his pig farm, and these leftover parts were then used to create products like soaps, shampoo, lipsticks, and even perfume. One victim was able to escape his horror, a sex worker named Wendy Lynn Essiter, who alleged that Pickton handcuffed her left hand, at which point he started to stab her. He stabbed and cut her a few times, once in the stomach. Wendy was thankfully able to take the knife from Pickton and stabbed him with it. She also made a daring escape. Somehow, both of them ended up in the same hospital, both being treated for their stab wounds. The staff at the hospital was able to finally unlock Wendy's left hand with the handcuff key found in Pickton's pocket while they were both at the hospital. Pickton would eventually be charged with attempted murder for what he'd tried to do to Wendy, but in a shocking twist, the case was dropped in January of 1998. One source would say they thought it was because the prosecution thought that the fact that Wendy was a drug user would make her an unreliable witness on the stand. From that case, though, evidence such as Pickton's boots and clothes were kept in storage but not tested for DNA until 2004, when it would come back as having been a match to two women who were now missing. One terrifying account by a witness in the trial would come from a woman who stayed at the farm for a while, working odd jobs for Pickton. Her name was Lynn Ellingson, and she was a witness to a night of horror that she would never forget. This witness would recant an evening where her and Pickton were doing drugs and decided to head out to find Pickton, a sex worker. After picking up the woman, and as the drugs were free-flowing, eventually Pickton and his lady would veer off and do their own thing while Lynn was on her own for a bit, eventually going to bed. She would say that she was awakened by a loud noise that was coming from a shack that everyone knew that Pickton used to butcher and slaughter his pigs. For whatever reason, Lynn's curiosity took over and she quietly walked down to the shack and peered through the crack of the door to see what was going on. She would say she saw Willie Pickton completely covered in blood and that he yanked her into the shack and forced her to look at the sex worker that they had picked up, now a dead victim. Lynn said that the woman was hanging, and then said she saw the woman's hair on a table in front of her, which led Lynn to assume that Pickton had scalped, skinned, and was in the process of disemboweling his victim. Pickton threatened Lynn not to ever say anything, which she promised she never would, and when Pickton sent her out to buy more drugs, Lynn bolted and never returned to the farm, and never told anyone what she saw. She was seemingly terrified of what would happen to her if she ever did. When people would ask where Lynn was later on and why she was no longer staying at the farm, sources said that Pickton gave a bullshit story about her stealing from him or something of the like. Can you fucking imagine seeing something like that? Like, all I can picture in my mind's eye is this freaky looking hillbilly, completely covered in blood, and behind him a woman hanging, covered in blood, maybe without her skin? Oh my fucking god, that is enough to fuck you up for life. Like, what? Pickton went on murdering women like this, unchecked and unfound, for an estimated 6 years. His victim count, while not 100% confirmed for sure, is alleged to be anywhere from 49 to 60 women he killed. Finally, in 2001, the RCMP, or Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and the Vancouver Police would form some kind of task force that's sole goal was to investigate the large amount of missing women in the area. Some of the investigators had an inkling that they were indeed dealing with a serial killer. There were a few things that would lead to what no one would have expected to find at the Pickton farm. First, there was a former employee of the Pickton farm who would come forward to say that he had personally seen guns he believed to be illegal in Pickton's 5-bedroom trailer. This information was enough to get a search warrant for the Pickton trailer, and when they bashed in the front door to act on that search warrant, the authorities had no idea that this search would end up being a 21-month-long search for evidence and DNA. Pickton was arrested for the weapons charges, and then he would actually be released on bail, but was closely watched and was told he could absolutely not go back to the pig farm while searches were being conducted under what was now a second search warrant. I guess during the first search, authorities would find an inhaler that belonged to Serena Abbotsway, a missing woman in the area. They would also find a weapon, a specific gun, in a laundry room that would later be tied to the deaths of 3 missing women. Some of the evidence that would be found inside the trailer consisted of restraint devices, women's clothing, jewelry, shoes, a gun said to be a .22 revolver that, attached over the barrel, was a large black and spiky dildo that had 1 round having been fired. I'm going to stop right there for a second, and I'm going to let that sink in. It's really giving toy box killer vibes, am I right? A dildo over a gun that has been fired. What in the actual fuck? Oh my god. The authorities would also find night vision goggles, 2 fur handcuffs, Spanish fly aphrodisiac, and even a syringe that was filled with the blue liquid inside. The authorities would also test some blood that was found inside of the motorhome, and it would be figured out that the blood belonged to a woman named Mona Wilson. Now Pickton was rearrested, and this time he would be charged with 2 counts of murder. As the search continued on the property, body parts would start to be found. Oh yes, body parts. The authorities would discover all sorts of different bones and parts, including a vertebrae, an elbow bone, a deltoid bone, a human tooth, 2 parts or pieces of a jawbone, 4 ribs, a pelvic bone, 14 different bone fragments, a piece of a human cheek flesh or tissue, a knee, and some fabric that had pieces of human tissue in it. Now, this is not a complete list. When you look this case up, you will see time and time again there are different lists of the things that they found. This is just the most compiled list that I could find. One source would say that inside of a freezer where Pickton kept alleged pig meat would be found the hands, feet, and heads of 2 missing women. The authorities were quickly realizing that this crime scene was going to be absolutely massive and would take a long time to search and sift through the property for as much DNA and evidence as they could find. They had no idea that they had just stumbled across Canada's most prolific serial killer. Just the sheer volume of acreage and the various machines that would have to be tested, for example, the wood chipper, would take months. In court documents, it would state that Willie Pickton was by trade a butcher, not only having the tools, but the means to slaughter pigs and victims alike. It was said that 3 of the victims' remains were seen to have had what the document said was unmistakable signs of having been butchered in the same way that Pickton butchered pigs. It would further state that there were seen vertical bisection of the skulls, and a saw was clearly used to remove the feet and hands, and this process is known as disarticulation. The authorities would at one point release a statement to Pickton's neighbors or anyone else who had bought meat from him that there could possibly be human remains in said meat. Can you fucking imagine being told that the butcher you usually get pig meat from may have mixed, whether on purpose or not, human meat into your dinner? Oh my God! The remains of at least 26 women would be found on the farm, but here's the kicker. While he was being investigated and held in a jail cell, his so-called cellmate was actually an undercover officer, and what Pickton had to tell him was very interesting. As Pickton was being interrogated, he wouldn't exactly admit to the things that he had done wrong yet. It was like he was feeling out the authorities to see what they had on him. He would eventually confess to his cellmate that he had killed 49 women, but he was planning one more to make it an even 50. He would also tell his cellmate, the cop, that he had a great way of getting rid of evidence through a rendering plant. When they talked about how he may have gotten caught, Pickton would admit that towards the end he was getting sloppy. One thing that got my attention personally was the fact that he kept telling his cellmate that he was going to go down for these crimes, but that other people would be getting in trouble too, alluding to the fact that he was not always alone in his murderous or torturous ways. Pickton would eventually be charged with the murders of 27 women in the first degree. Court documents show that the judge in the pretrial tossed one count and said to have severed 20 others. I'm guessing to make them second-degree cases because there was no lying in wait or proof of planning, but that's just my conjecture. He was charged then with 6 first-degree murder charges, but was found guilty of second-degree murder in all 6 of those cases. After the guilty verdicts were returned, his case was appealed by the Crown successfully because of the severance of cases, and now he was going to be on trial for all 26 counts of first-degree murder. Pickton, during the first trial, when he gave the statement to the authorities, described himself as a quote-unquote head honcho, basically being responsible for the deaths of these missing women, but he did straight up tell them that there were other people involved as well. During the trial, the prosecution would open with what one source called a chilling account of what Pickton would do to his victims. They stated that he would murder them, slaughter them, and get rid of the evidence. He would shoot his victims in the back of their heads and then proceed to decapitate them. He would sometimes bisect them with what the prosecutor said was a reciprocating saw and then would take off their hands and feet. They would further state that these severed parts were found in buckets in a freezer and in a trash can on the farm. During this, one person got up and had to leave, and other family members of the victims had to sit there enduring what had happened to their loved ones, sobbing all the while. The Canadian Encyclopedia would describe the jury as shell-shocked. There would be called at least a whopping 240 witnesses in what was going to be a lengthy and extremely expensive trial. Apparently, the investigation alone was the largest in Canadian history and cost the upwards of $70 million. And then they had to budget yet another $46 million. Investigators were said to have taken 200,000 DNA samples and also took 600,000 articles from the property for investigation. Pickton would receive an automatic life sentence for the charges that he faced. There were 20 more murder charges pending that the Crown would eventually say that most likely wouldn't see a courtroom since Pickton had the maximum sentence already. Weirdly though, under Canadian law at the time, had Pickton been found guilty of first-degree murder that the prosecution was wanting, then he wouldn't have been eligible for parole until spending at least 25 years in prison. But because he was charged with second-degree murder, he could have been eligible for parole in as little as 10 years. Oh, Canada, you wonderfully nice neighbor to the north. Some people just aren't redeemable. Of course, there would be investigations into the Pickton case about how law enforcement failed, basically, and why he took so long to catch. Apparently, the police were tipped off 2 different times about the possibility that Willie Pickton and the pig farm could be connected to some of the missing women. And this was back in 1998 and then again in 1999. And nothing was done. So sad. Alright, so get this. I guess in 2016, Pickton came out with his own, allegedly written autobiography called Pickton, in his own words. And someone in Denver called Outskirts Press published it. Yeah. It was on Amazon for a while, but eventually got yanked off when there was a huge public outrage. They wanted to make sure that fucker never saw a dime or profit ever from the shit he's done, among other reasons, of course. It was said that he claimed his innocence in the book and that it was written by Pickton, but he had smuggled it out of prison where the alleged author typed it up for him. There were representatives of Pickton who said that since the beginning, he has wanted to talk about the crimes, but that he wanted a deal to share who else was involved in these crimes, because he alleged it was not just him. Sadly, the world may never know who else are sick fucks up there, because on May 19th of last year, so 2024, another inmate attacked Pickton at the maximum security prison in Quebec, saying that they did it for the victims. If I remember correctly, there was some talk about his possible parole coming up. They stabbed Pickton in the head with the handle of a broken broom or something of the sort. Pickton, then 74, was put on life support and put into a medically induced coma where he would never wake up. Willie Pickton then, thankfully, died on May 31st. Some sources would say that there was a 200-page handwritten tell-all book found in his cell after his murder. But there is an ongoing dispute by the families of the victims and the investigators on whether they should have the right to read what was written. One statement that came out saying that there was nothing about the victims in there, at least not the ones who never went to trial and who were still dying to know what happened to their loved ones. The families feel that it shouldn't be just the police alone who get to read it, but rather feel like their lawyers should get to read it and decide if it's worth telling the families, and I agree with them. How would I feel if it were my loved one and the police dropped the ball on this case time and time again, resulting in deaths of so many women? The police department would come out with a huge apology for the things that they didn't do when it came to stopping Pickton, and saying that they wish that they could go back and catch him sooner. And that, my friends, is the story of Robert Pickton, the disgusting, smelly pig farmer who lured sex workers back to his farm, murdered them, did all sorts of fucked up things to them, and then fed the remains to his pigs. Yeah, gross, right? Oh man, this story is just one of those stories that unfortunately is more about the serial killer than the victims, because the sheer volume of victims, it's sadly just too many to cover. If you are curious though, there are lists all over online with the names and possible dates of these poor women who went through God knows what. In my mind, as I was learning and researching this case further, because I had heard it a long time ago, but I wanted to know more, I could picture this dirty, nasty fucker in my head doing this shit. Like, when the witness came forward about what he forced her to see, the woman hanging in there with some of her skin gone, maybe her head was already off, I think, too, and oh god, just picturing him for whatever reason in like one of those butcher aprons, covered in blood, with a horrible smile on his face in a dim-lit shack, freaks my ever-loving shit. One of the sources that I read for this case talked about how Pickton would grin from ear to ear menacingly when he was in his cell before he was charged and his cellmate was that undercover cop. Like, he was very proud of what he had done and he wanted to tell people about his great accomplishments of what he did to these women. When he was being interrogated, I read back and forth, and he would not admit whether he tortured the women or not, but hello, of course he did. He had to have, right? I mean, they found a dildo on a gun, for fuck's sake. They found fingernails and stuff too, like those didn't just fall off, you know? Oh god, I hope for the victims' sake that they did not suffer long. There's a movie or two out about him too, I believe. One is called Pig Killer. That came out in 2022. The reviews look just awful. It's like 3.7 stars out of 10. But it's based on Willie Pickton, and I wonder if it's just one of those horrifically made slasher-type films. I feel like a company with a big budget could really make a terrifying movie about this sick fuck. Maybe there's more out there, I just don't know about them, but I'm not gonna lie, I am a little bit tempted to watch the horrible one. I recognize one of the actors from Frighteners, if you've ever seen that movie. All I can think is like Wrong Turn or The Hills Have Eyes type shit of this sick little weirdo doing whatever he wants with these marginalized women once he gets them to his isolated farm area. Poor things, it's just awful. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed learning about this pig fucker as much as I did, and please, let's all just be careful around pig farms, alright? Don't go falling into their pin. You don't know if the owner hasn't fed them in months, and they may just take a nibble at you. Come on back next Monday when we will cover another case here on The Kill File where nothing stays buried forever. Stay safe, you guys. Bye. All right, guys, that's going to do it for today. A few quick reminders before you go. Please don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on your platform. It will help the podcast grow and other true crime lovers to find us. Also, check out the website, TheKillFile.com, where you can suggest a case, find our merch shop, and submit a listener file. Follow The Kill File on your favorite social media platforms. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Blue Sky, and TikTok. Of course, you can always subscribe on YouTube as well. Find all of the links for the socials on the website. Come back on Mondays wherever you get your podcast fix when we will cover another case on The Kill File where nothing stays buried forever. Stay safe, you guys. Bye.